So I want to talk very quickly about how to use a style sheet to style some common elements on a page together. So I'm gonna start to delete from my example. This is an ASP.NET page. It's actually called a view, but it looks an awful lot like HTML. It looks an awful lot like what a normal HTML page would look like, except it's got some special ASP.NET markup called Razor inside of here. Razor just runs on the server side and pushes out HTML code to the browser. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. I'm going to save my changes and just reload my browser. Don't worry about what's here. This was from my previous demonstration. This code right here in my HTML page rendered these two boxes. I have a text box I called username and another text box I called password. The text box on line 7 rendered this first box. The text box on line 8 rendered this one. If I look at the view source, I can see two input boxes. I have an input tag here and another one that starts over here. One is to hold the username and one is to hold the password. They're both of type text. That's what a text box is. And by default they have no text inside them and nor value inside of them. When I said on line 7 that I wanted to name my text box username, it rendered this HTML. Notice over here in my Razor markup, I didn't actually write the input tags. Razor made it for me. So now let's say I want to style these two things together. Maybe I want to put some padding around them, or some margin around them, or a border around them. One way to do that is to use a div. A div is an HTML tag. It has a bracket, a begin or less than sign, and a greater than sign. It's a div tag. Here's the end div tag. They come in pairs, and everything else inside of here is inside of that div. So if I save this and I reload my page, and I look at the view source, I can see I now have this begin div and this end div that I didn't have before. And that begin div and that end div is encapsulating my two input boxes. It wraps my two input boxes. So I'm going to give my div an ID, and I'm going to call it wrapper. And if I save this and reload my browser, you can expect that I would have a div tag called wrapper. But now I want to style this div to have some border or padding around it. The way I do that is I create a CSS file, and in that CSS file I have a CSS class called wrapper, and it is meant to work on HTML elements that have the name or an ID of wrapper. That's what this pound sign means. It means things with a name of or an ID of wrapper. So I go back over here. Well, I have an element, the div element with the ID of wrapper. And so this styling should apply to any HTML element with an ID of wrapper. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go back over to my index page, and I'm going to save that, and I'm going to refresh. And this isn't going to work. I just wanted to show you for a second. I'm going to reload my page, and it didn't apply any styling. I don't see anything special. I don't see a border solid 1 pixel red. I don't know what that is, but we'll see what that looks like in a second. I don't see any padding of 10 pixels. I will see what I normally saw before. The reason why is my HTML page doesn't reference my CSS file. It has no idea about it. And in Visual Studio, the way I can create that link is by going over here to my Solution Explorer, finding my style sheet, and bringing it into a special section of my HTML page called the head. So here's the head tag, here's an end head tag, and inside of those head tags I have a link to my style sheet, style.css. That's just a file that sits over here, has this content in it. So now my HTML file will know of that style.css page. And I've saved, and I'm going to reload my page. Now I can see my div. My div called wrapper was specified to have a 1 pixel red border and 10 pixels of padding. I see the 1 pixel red border fairly clearly, and by default a div says the width of the div is the width of the view of the thing I'm looking at. So if I bring this down, I can see the width of my div ends right here, this width from left to right. If I expand it out way over here to the right, it ends right here. It's not the length of these two elements. Divs by default is the width of the page, of the thing that it's being viewed in. So the padding, 10 pixels, I see 10 pixels above or inside of my div. This 10 pixels below the text box and above the red line, this area right in here, is 10 pixels high. It's 10 pixels of separation. Over here there's 10 pixels of separation. Over here there's 10 pixels of separation. And although you can't see it necessarily, there's 10 pixels of separation over here. It's just that my two elements don't fill that div, and by default they're not meant to. I can change their width if I wanted to, but I didn't specify that. So I can see my div, my wrapper div, and I can see the padding that I get because I've added this wrapper CSS class. There's another way I can do it. Instead of using the ID, I can use something called class. And I will say this div no longer has an ID attribute, it just has a class attribute called myCoolDivClass. I'm going to save this and I'm going to refresh it over here, and this isn't going to work either. I'm just doing it for purposes of demonstration. I don't get my styling anymore. If I look over here at the CSS, I don't get the border or the padding. It's because it's still looking for an ID of wrapper. Well, I don't have an ID for one, and it's not called wrapper, the second one. So if I take this myCoolDiv class name and I paste it over here, this isn't going to work either because there's nothing with an ID of myCoolDiv class. There's something with a class of myCoolDiv class, but nothing with an ID. So in my CSS, what I do is I replace this pound sign, which means ID, with something with a period, which means class. So now any element in my HTML page that has the myCoolDiv class is going to get this styling. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to my browser, and I can see my browser was smart enough to refresh for me. It applied this style to my div because it had a class named myCoolDivClass. What I can do is I can make a copy of this whole div, and I'm going to put it in my HTML down below. And I'm going to take out the text boxes, and I'm just going to type in the word Steve. And so now I have two divs. I have this div that wraps the username and password. I have this div that wraps my name. They both have a class of myCoolDiv class. I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to reload my page. And although it's kind of hard to see, there's actually two borders. There's a border that makes this box, and there's a border that makes this top box. The purposes of this is to say that I can put class attributes on many different divs and share the same styles, but also the padding that is defined for that style applies to both. Hopefully this gives you a demonstration of how to add a div tag to your HTML page, wrap some content regardless of whether it's Razor or HTML, and apply some styling to it. Some things to note: you don't ever add HTML tags inside of your CSS. CSS doesn't understand the HTML tag, so I'll never put a div tag in my CSS file. And a good practice, I'll never add styles to my HTML. It just doesn't know what those things are. If I want a solid 1 pixel border red, this will never work in my HTML the way I've written it. So only styles go in the style sheet, and only HTML tags and content go in my view, in my HTML file. Hopefully that helps also alleviate or help you better understand HTML tags are always going to be in your HTML, in your view. Styles are the only thing in your style sheet, and putting one inside of both usually isn't a good usually won't work and isn't a good practice. So hopefully that also helps you understand how to wrap a number of elements in a div and apply some styling to that div to provide spacing.